So what happens as a feminist when you accept the idea that human beings have a nature and that the nature of men and women is actually not the same? How did
Well,
you get there?
it depends. It depends which version of feminism you adhere to. But I think as a movement, it's always been deeply ambivalent about that question. On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no. And I mean, the best way to answer, the best way to come at this actually is historically. The way I set out to understand the women's movement in Feminism Against Progress is as a materially grounded response by women to the social changes affected by the Industrial Revolution.
Mayor Harrington, welcome to the Evolve Move Play podcast. It's a real pleasure to get the chance to speak to you. You are a writer, a columnist for Unheard, and the author of Feminism Against Progress, which is a really wonderful book. I think you're one of the premier sort of wordsmiths in the space right now, and you become a major figure on many, showing up on many podcasts. And I don't even know what to call the space that you sort of occupy. It's kind of adjacent to Jordan Peterson, kind of adjacent to the meaning space. I was listening to an interview you did with Paul Kingsnorth and Rebel Wisdom back in the day, the War on Reality. I thought that was a particularly good one. And so that kind of sense-making space. Do you have a sense for what the space you occupy is in the cultural zeitgeist right now?
Not really, to be honest. I don't know. I mean, I never really like some people. Some people try and characterize me as a conservative, but I've never really felt like that was true. I mean, I guess it's sort of trendy to pretend that you don't really have, I'm of no politics, or I
Right.
didn't leave the left left me, or whatever. I don't know.
Mhm.
I think I just try and I take an interest in trying to see and talk about things which feel true to me. And when things stop feeling true for whatever reason, then I might sometimes change my view, or it feels like the facts on the ground have changed, and I might change my view. So I sort of I suppose I resist factionalism or political tribes in that sense, because if groups can kind of come adrift from being focused on things that are true just by
Right.
virtue of internal social dynamics. I think it's a familiar failure mode. And
Absolutely.
and they, I'm always nervous about throwing in my lot with a social group
Mm.
to the extent that I then feel like I can't say things which are true, or there's a set of things which I'm not allowed to talk about for whatever reason. So I suppose I sort of I keep myself, but I'm reluctant to answer your question just for that reason.
I
I
think that's
mean,
a
there
good
have
answer.
been, yeah.
I'm happy. I enjoyed that answer. One group that you have identified with, your book is called Feminism Against Progress. And I think what really attracts me to your work is the shared sense that human nature is not something that can easily be dismissed. And I think that's something that is often not popular in feminist circles. So I'm curious I know that your background kind of as a young writer and in your exploration of ideas really started with a really strong commitment to feminism. And that's actually, I think, surprisingly to maybe many people who see you as a conservative, still pretty central to the way you think about things is advocacy for women and understanding the way that women see the world. So what happens as a feminist when you accept the idea that human beings have a nature and that the nature of men and women is actually not the same? How did
Well,
you get there?
it depends. It depends which version of feminism you adhere to. But I think as a movement, it's always been deeply ambivalent about that question. It's sort of on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no. And I mean, the best way to answer, the best way to come at this actually is historically. In this, the way I set out to understand the women's movement in Feminism Against Progress is as a materially grounded response by women to the social changes affected by the Industrial Revolution. So, in a sense, it's women's aggregate response to modernity. It
Mhm.
produces the women's movement, because there are ways in which modernity, as like the paradigm of modernity, sets women structurally at a disadvantage. By predicating this kind of neutral, autonomous, self-actualizing self, who's in a sense, always, as a precondition for personhood as such, separated from all of the other selves. That's the kind of,
Mhm.
and there are ways in which, particularly if you're a mother, that's just less true for women
Yeah.
than it is for men. And I think Rousseau explicitly excludes women from personhood in his understanding of it. He sees us as sort of charming, compliant support humans. Our job is to be cute and pretty and educate the young, and to produce heirs. But we're not really people in the Rousseauian sense. And not unreasonably, there are plenty of women who like to dispute
Yeah.
that. Of
Yeah.
course, don't be ridiculous. Of course, we're people.
Yeah.
But that then raises the question: if liberal subjectivity is problematic for a person who has a female body, then is that a problem? Is the problem women, or is the problem liberal subjectivity? And I think the women's movement. I mean, at the philosophical level, the women's movement has gone round and round and round and round that particular problem in a bunch of different ways over the course of the history of feminism. But at a concrete level, women's activism has always been deeply ambivalent about how you answer that question, because on the one hand, and really you see this from the beginning of the women's movement. It's a movement which sets out to make the case for women as people, in the full recognition of our embodied capacities. And then on the other hand, there's also a bunch of women who are saying, no, actually, we want to enter the market on the same terms as men. We want to enter market society on the same terms as men, and that means embracing this abstract self-actualizing self. Which, and just ignoring the fact that it's structurally more problematic for women than it is for men in some respects. And so this is an inherent tension in the women's movement. I've characterized this in the book as the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care.
Mhm.
So on the one hand, there are women who want, there's a whole basket of political issues specific to women which are addressed by feminists, which are to do with pregnancy and motherhood and female embodiment and the raising of children and everything which goes with that. And then on the other hand, there's a whole other basket of political issues which are also addressed by feminists, which sometimes come into conflict with the first basket, the feminism of care, which are issues of autonomy and self-actualization and political personhood and agency, employment, egalitarian, equality in the workplace, equality in the public sphere, and so on. And some of those issues. I mean, let me think to give you a concrete example. Is if you look like this needs to be made less abstract. Okay, so here's a concrete example. Might be the question of sex-specific protections in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is an issue where you'll find feminists on both sides, because in some contexts it's absolutely appropriate to treat female-bodied people in the workplace separately from men. For example, in a manufacturing context, you need separate bathrooms. You might need regulations governing how much weight a worker is expected to lift. You
Mm-hmm.
might need regulations governing, is it licit to allow an extremely pregnant woman to
Mm-hmm.
continue working 14-hour shifts on an assembly line?
Yeah.
There's a whole basket of very, very concrete embodied questions that are connected to manual labor, where feminists may, feminist activists may say, no, absolutely, we need to make the case for women's distinctiveness from men in the context of pursuing women's interests here. And then there's a whole other set of workplaces where again very ardent feminist voices might say, no, absolutely, we need to abolish all the sex-specific protections, because this is the only way that, say, a female lawyer or somebody else who works cognitively rather than physically is going to be treated in every respect the same as a man. Because say I work I always use the example of lawyers, but there's a bunch of cognitive, white collar jobs where there's no theoretical reason why I as a woman shouldn't do the same work as you, a man, because fundamentally what we're doing is work that happens cognitively rather than in an embodied way. So in theory, there really is no meaningful, or very little significant difference between us. And in that context, and the women and feminists who are focused on those kinds of workplaces will take a very different view on the question of sex, of treating workers differently depending on their sex, and will argue against it. So I think that I hope that gives you an idea of the way these issues can become very. Feminism is, in a sense, that war has always been somewhat conflicted internally about whether it's in women's interests to be treated in every respect as the same as men, or whether it's more in women's interests to be treated in some respects as distinct from men. And the answer is and both can be true, just in very different contexts.
So what I hear is you pointing out basically a class dimension here,
Yes,
that white
absolutely.
collar work really kind of leads towards a philosophy of wanting to deny difference. Like I've
Yes.
talked to young feminist women who've told me that the only reason that men are physically larger than women is because of socialization. Somehow we socialize boys to, yeah, to eat more protein, and therefore they grow larger. And that when
Um,
we achieve the feminist utopia, that actually all physical differences between men and women will disappear.
I think I've never actually met somebody who sincerely believes this, but I really, anytime I come across that range of views, I really want to encourage those people to raise a clutch of chickens. Because when you do that, chances are you'll get boy chickens and girl chickens.
Mhm.
And when you raise boy chickens and girl chickens together, it becomes very clear within about 6 weeks that boy chickens and girl chickens are not, the reason
No.
they grow up different is not parenting.
Yeah, yeah.
Because no
There's
parenting is involved,
yeah.
and yet somehow cockerels don't cockerel, and yeah,
Works the same if you raise human children. If you have enough of them to
yes,
have them of both sexes, there's research that shows that women who have no children have the most blank slate view of
yes.
human sex differences, and women who
Yes.
have multiple children of both sexes have the least blank slate view. And
Right,
I,
because I mean, at that, once you've, I mean, I've only got the one, so I'm sort of, I have a very
yeah,
small sample, but she is who she is, and it's very clear, in conversation with friends of mine who are mothers of more than one, it's immediately obvious that every child's differently, it really isn't just a
mhm,
matter of
yeah,
parenting, they you there's a shaping contribution that parents make, absolutely, but they come with a bunch of stuff, and some of that is organismic,
yeah,
and this is it, you have to be incredibly ideologically blinkered not to see that, I think,
yeah.
as a parent. And and once you've had four or five, I think women become just, mothers become fairly kind of, yeah, it just is what it is.
We have three, two girls and a boy, and I mean the differences are so stark and so obvious, and from such an early stage.
Yeah,
It's really it's quite fascinating. So there's this element of class. I also, one of my curiosities is you talk about the modern individual, the liberal ideal of the individual, and how, in some sense, motherhood puts the lie to the very idea of the individual. Am I
yeah, I
putting
think.
words in your mouth, or is that an
No,
apt
no,
description?
you're not. You're not. I mean, I think pretty much the first time I tried to frame the arguments that turned into feminism against progress was an article called "Motherhood Put an End to My Liberalism,"
Mm,
and it was just very simply trying to explain how, I'd always believed that being kind of self-contained and self-actualizing, in the kind of the modern liberal sense was the end point of feminism. That I should be autonomous, and I should be self-directing, and I should be self-actualizing, and that I shouldn't be. And when I had a baby, I realized that this is wrong. It's incorrect on a number of different axes. For one thing, you spend 9 months during pregnancy as being not entirely just one person, but also not quite two, which
yeah,
is that just doesn't compute from a liberal individualistic point of view. There's no language for explaining what that is within that framework. This is one of the reasons why the liberal framework has such difficulty with the question of abortion or pregnancy and motherhood, full stop. Tends to be treated as a problem to be solved, and I think some of that problem is actually metaphysical, and that people, it's just
yeah,
extremely difficult to grok the idea of being not quite one person, not quite two, or being symbiotically interconnected. As I discovered, you remain to your baby for really quite a long time. There's a sense. I mean, I don't want to sound sort of wacky and woo woo, but I had a sense of being energetically interconnected with my baby in a way which was not. It wasn't just the physiological fact of her depending on me for milk. It was very much subtler and very much more visceral than that. I'd go into full on panic mode if I was separate
yeah,
from her for too long. I'd wake up in the night a few moments before she woke up wanting food. there were, yeah, it felt like I was sort of Bluetoothed to her. I mean, I call it
Mhm.
the mum Bluetooth.
Yeah,
And I, you know,
it's a good name.
and most mums will report something along those lines. I mean, I had a friend who would experience a letdown reflex when her baby was in preschool, when her baby was with a childminder several miles away, at the point where the baby was having something to eat. So there's something indefinable going on there that, again, liberal individualism doesn't really have language for. It's very it just doesn't end run round rationality altogether, and just taps into parts of our organism which are very, very, very remote from the sort of rational front brain choosing autonomous directed linear consciousness, which I think we associate with modernity and with that kind of individualism. And yeah, and experiencing that, somebody who's generally sort of habitually quite bookish and habitually quite, all up in my head. And I've always wrestled with questions of embodiment and found, I think about it a lot because I find it difficult, I guess,
Mm.
as is often the way I think with these things. You know, it was properly a culture shock to have a child and suddenly have, all of those polite fictions just completely blown away. I think the only time I've ever damaged a car, pretty much in 20 odd years of driving, was when my child was screaming in the back, and I just could not
Mm.
think
Yeah.
because she was hungry, and because of that, I just, my whole person. I don't want to say my mind was my. Yeah, my entire person was just focused on something which is
Yeah.
just very not compatible with operating heavy machinery.
So you're,
It's just-
yeah,
yeah, yeah, total kind of snow crash. Yeah.
I find it so interesting that, I was I suppose that I have a very nerdy, bookish side to my personality, and kind of fell into that nerdy bookishness in my early teens. But then I reached pretty early in my life for a deep embodiment. So I went to gymnastics and basketball and martial arts, and then eventually parkour. And I look around all the time, and I see people now in kind of this intellectual space talking about the need for embodiment. And I was, you had a chat with Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson at ARC, where Jordan said something like, in the age of in the age of AI, I think it was in the age of AI, we need to return to the body, something like that. And it's great. I agree completely. I also saw him recently on Joe Rogan talking about how play is the opposite of tyranny. And then he just drops the idea. It's, well, what are you going to do about it? Right. I feel a lot of times like I'm listening to people who are virgins talking about sex, where they're like, I think we should start having it. It's going to be good. Like, it's necessary.
Equally, though, I mean, there's a sense in which, here we are on the internet talking about embodiment, and there's, the
Mhm.
paradox
Oh,
is right there. You know,
for
I'm
sure.
I'm I'm
You're
I'm
disembodied heads
I'm
right now.
yeah, we're disembodied heads right now. I don't even know where you are geographically. I'm
Yeah.
currently not in my own home geographically. I'm
Mhm.
so halfway around the world in the wrong time zone, and here we are on the internet talking about embodiment. That's
Mhm.
the whole
Yeah.
predicament right there. And there's
It
a
is.
there's a sense in which, even though I think both of us have fairly well developed practices of embodiment. I mean, that's your whole thing.
Right there.
It's not something I discuss so much because who was it who said that writing about music is like dancing about architecture? Just kind of, and there's a sense in which, sitting on the internet talking about embodiment is a bit like that. It's like dancing about architecture,
Mm.
because when the whole point of embodiment is that you're doing the thing, and
Yeah.
if we're talking about the thing, we're not doing the thing. And I think it's a little, yes, absolutely, Jordan might say we need to return to the body, but if he's sat there on somebody's podcast, he's not doing the thing. And I have no idea, maybe he goes home and he does the thing, and maybe
You
he
just
just
started
doesn't want to
doing
talk about it. We
yoga.
don't know.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. I know.
but so I think one of the things that really interests me about your thought in particular is the way you've been able to look at the metaphysics that underlie some of these fundamental assumptions that we're making that drive us towards disembodiment, and how they relate also to the evolution of technology, right? So you talk about, we live in the age of the transhuman, or even something like feminism, as it's in many ways downstream of technological changes, or it's a
Yeah.
response to technological
Yes,
changes.
absolutely. And actually, I think you can refine that a little bit more in the context of feminism, because there are distinct we've been through another tech transition since the beginning of feminism,
Hmm.
and I've distinguished the feminism of the industrial era from the feminism of the transhuman era. And I think this is the fact that we now live in the transhuman era, and have done actually for longer than I've been alive, is one of the reasons that feminism is now is in the middle of is struggling again with some of its priors. So I mean, the what women were responding to during the industrial era was a whole series of transformations that occurred, as it were, out there in the world. I mean, of course, you can make the McLuhanite point that they also transform people's interiority, which is true. But all of the changes of the Industrial Revolution were they were focused on technologies which drew on and instrumentalized and technologized and set out to master the world outside us. Towards, as Francis Bacon puts it, the relief of man's estate. And what really changes after the Second World War, and well, actually one of my big unanswered questions at the moment, big sort of lines of inquiry, is why? Why did it change? But nonetheless, it's very clear that what did change after the Second World War was that outward focus in our sort of the technological mindset inverted, it reversed, and it sort of boomeranged back onto the human person itself. So instead of setting industrializing the production of food or clothing or animals or whatever, transport or any of the other great sort of outward innovations, we turned exactly the same mindset and the same sort of instrumentalist thinking towards the project of re-engineering humans ourselves, human bodies and human souls. And really the inflection point, as I've argued in the book, for that was the contraceptive pill. In that it's an incredibly undervalued radical moment in medical technology, because where all of thousands of years of medicine up to that point, the purpose of every medical intervention from Hippocrates to the 1960s had been ordered towards fixing what's broken, which has behind it tacitly just taken for granted a normative picture of what human health looks like. And that everybody just understands is there. That human nature is, like everyone has a sort of a gestalt intuitive grasp of what a healthy human organism is like. And most of medical training, at least implicitly, understands all of the things that can go wrong with a human organism in the context of what a humanism looks like going right. So the normative picture of human health is there in medicine all the way up to the 1960s, and then the pill comes along, and what the pill does is very different. It doesn't set out to fix something that's broken, saying, I have a problem with my liver, or one of my nostrils is fused shut, or my wrist is broken, and doesn't set out it sets out to break normal, healthy fertility in the interests of personal freedom. And that just opens Pandora's box for biotech.
Yeah.
Because once you've accepted in principle that you can break normative human health in the interests of personal freedom, there is in theory no upper limit to the interventions you can make in normative physiology ordered towards individual desire. And that opens up the human body for technological capture, and which is really reorders the human body in a very intimate way to the market. And I mean, and the whole second part of Feminism Against Progress is exploring the consequences of that and the feminism which has emerged in response to that. Which again, there are many sides to it, because on the one hand, again, the split on this class axis, you find more bourgeois women on the whole benefit from this, because it's genuinely emancipatory. More women can go to college because they can plan. More women enter the workplace because they're not randomly having. It provides a greater sense of control over fertility, such that those women who are in a position to take advantage of that, who've got the social and cultural capital to leverage that, really kind of flourish. So it genuinely is liberatory. But the flip side of that is, particularly further down the food chain, it opens up women's bodies to the market, and so you see an explosion in pornography. You see libertarian defences of pornography in the sex industry, and then further again down the transhumanist chute, you start to see the commodification of women's bodies, for example, in the trade in gametes and now commercial surrogacy. And there are really the third wave defense of the sex industry as genuinely empowering to women, framed within the feminism of freedom. So then but it all makes sense. in the context of the new tech transition, seen only from the perspective of the feminism of freedom. But from a sex realist feminist perspective, there are obviously problems with it, and when you look at the injustices perpetrated through the class hierarchy, there are obviously problems to it. And so then, of course, you have feminists on that side as well. I mean, the radical feminists have always protested the porn industry, and they've always protested. They've all they never deluded themselves that there was no fundamental there was no fundamental reality to sex difference. Radical feminists have been very clear and unyielding on that, and rightly so. But yeah, I mean, this is very complicated territory. So that's downstream of the tech transition into transhumanism, which I guess that brings us up to where we are now.
I want to double click on this a little bit because I think it gets really to kind of core interest for me that I think we share, which is if you think about the idea of the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom, right? In many ways, the idea of freedom, even freed from specifically a feminist thing, but really the technological liberation, the idea that through technology we liberate ourselves, that we find freedom. My brain is sort of churning a bunch of different things at the moment, but I don't know if it's you or Louise Perry who quotes this in your book, but you talk about a quote from Simone de Beauvoir. One of you guys do, about Simone de Beauvoir saying that really the ultimate aim for women is to escape the feminine, to escape the demands of the biological body on women, of motherhood, because you can't be a fully self-actualizing free person so long as you're capable of getting pregnant in some sense. Do you remember the quote I'm referring to?
I think it's possibly Louise who quoted that, but I mean, but that is very much de Beauvoir's perspective. I mean,
Yeah.
she is only one voice, and there are very much more sex realist feminists than Simone de Beauvoir. But there's a sense in which, from inside the paradigm that she's talking from, it's kind of true. If you accept all the other premises that Simone de Beauvoir accepts, what she's saying is basically true. And what she's really calling out is that structural disadvantage that women have always had within the entire liberal frame, and not unreason. I think it really, the charitable read on the sort of techno utopian end of feminism is that once you accept all of those things in principle, actually, the tech fix really does look like the least worst solution. And if you want to step outside that, you have to dispute the entire framework at a much more fundamental level. Which means which is I guess this is why I've ended up down a metaphysical rabbit hole and a philosophy of technology rabbit hole, because I did set out to dispute that paradigm at a much more fundamental level, and the moment you do that, you end up back at Francis Bacon, and thence Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham. And that way madness lies, or something. I don't know.
Well, I think I've been walking down a similar rabbit hole from a very strangely different place, but I mean, my fundamental thing was somehow fitness doesn't work, right? Like most people think that they should exercise and then don't.
Yes.
And so why don't they exercise? It's like the fundamental idea behind what I do is basically they don't exercise because we're not treating them like human beings. We're not training them in ways that are congruent with their nature. In the same way you mentioned that, when you raise chickens, if you're not going to rely on all of the most egregious draconian tools of the Industrial Revolution that are available now, you have to kind of understand a chicken's nature to do it successfully.
Yes. Yeah. You have to give them somewhere, unless you're going to inflict chicken totalitarianism on them in a factory farm setting. You have to give them somewhere to scratch and peck. Actually, I mean, I use chickens as an example of things having a nature, because most people just get it very instinctively, because the nature of chickens is quite simple, and they're just quite funny as creatures. But it's obvious, if you spend even 5 or 10 minutes observing chickens, just allowing their chickenness to just present itself to you, rather than trying to think about them too rationally, it's that there's just a real delight for me in watching them scratch and peck, because they work so hard at it at one level, but on the other hand, it's just the easiest thing in the world for them. They scratch and they peck because that's what chickens do, and you can see that they really enjoy it. There's a sort of joyfulness and an ease and an effortfulness about it, which just says they're in their lane and focused and flourishing.
Hmm.
They're chickening, and there's a joyful feeling that comes from watching a creature do what's given to it to do. And I think this whole sort of exploration of the philosophy of technology has brought me back, again and again and again to the same question, which it sounds like you're exploring from the question of physical wellness. What is it that's given to us to do, such that actually doing it is not painfully effortful? And I think
Exactly.
this is, yeah. I mean, this is, I've written before about, the basic wrong-headedness of grindset from exactly this point of view. And
Hmm.
I think, actually, again, you very quickly end up back at Thomas Aquinas again, who says, the
Hmm.
essence of virtue is not what's difficult, but what's good.
Mm. Yes. Yeah.
And actually, what's good isn't, what's good could be difficult. Sometimes it can be an effort to keep ourselves on the path which is good, but it isn't necessarily difficult. And what's difficult can be good, but it isn't necessarily good. The two things are just, they're just different in kind. And the good is what's given to us to do.
Yes. I, so yeah, I see that in our culture so much. This idea that my friend John Vervaeke talks about sophrosyne and inkratia. Sophrosyne being self-control that is without effort, right? You don't eat the chocolate cake because the chocolate cake isn't salient to you, even though you know it's delicious. It just doesn't matter. Inkratia is when you have to exert will to do it. And so I
Mhm.
think that a lot of what we are trying to do is train people how to exercise and build up their capacity for encratia to set up their life such that they're operating within the sophrosyne all the time.
Yes.
Which,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
order
yeah,
to do that,
exactly.
we have to actually begin to accept that we have a human nature, a male nature, a female nature, and individual natures that are actually our guide for what's going to allow us to,
Right.
to
Exactly.
chicken
And
well or to rafe well or to
exactly.
marry well, right?
Right, exactly. And some of that is organismic and, is
Mhm.
common to people generally, and some of it is personality based. I mean,
Exactly.
when I was younger, I really wanted to be somebody who was really good at entrepreneurship, and eventually I just had to accept that that's just not who I am. I suck at those things. I'm terrible at it.
I'm
I'm,
learning
I'm,
that
I'm so
lesson.
far. I'm so far from being that person that this
Mm,
like doing that is just a spectacular waste of effort. However, there are other things which it's given to me to be good at, and
mm,
once I accepted that, actually, working hard just isn't hard
mm.
because
Yeah.
because it's a pleasure. Yeah, in that sense, I mean, again, there's a class component to this because not everybody is blessed with the opportunity to do the work which is just easy and
Yeah.
aligned with their nature. And some people do. Some
Yeah.
people you got to eat, right? And that's just a brute fact of living. And I feel incredibly blessed to have that, to have been given that, and to know how different that is to effortfully living because you have to, effortfully working because you have to. There's just a complete difference in kind. But
Yeah.
but knowing that difference exists, I think is the beginning of figuring out what it means to Rafe well or to Mary well or to, in the
Yeah.
sense of chickening well. To even know that such a distinction exists, and actually that there's a pass. I don't want to say a receptive mode of coming of self knowledge, and not purely an instrumental grind set oriented, willed and effortful one of forming ourselves. Self actualizing is from the sort of modern perspective. The what's the Carl Rogers was, self-actualizing is something, it implicitly, the whole of therapy culture is always telling us that self-actualizing is something we do. But there's a sense, I mean, from the medieval point of view, act and potential, but act is the realization of a potential which was always already there.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
which is sort of grounded in the nature of the thing, and to think about actualizing oneself from that perspective is actually, requires a measure of humility in relation to that, the potential that was already there, and a willingness to actually, still yourself enough to understand what that is, and also what it isn't,
Yeah.
so that you don't
Yeah.
waste 15 years trying to be something that you aren't, like I did.
Yeah. That reminds me also of the Tao, right? The Tao is
Mm.
unfolding, and the goal isn't, you can't change the Tao or completely define the Tao. You try to align yourself with its flow, which is also sort of reminds me of the Jungian idea of the self. The self is this this summary of potentials, right? And as our actuality can either be a better or worse expression of that unique, which is essentially the forms, right? There is actually a form that is Mary, and in this life you can live that more fully or less fully in some sense, and that has a lot to do with how much you will enjoy life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just sort of bringing that back down to your concrete interest
Mm-hmm.
in physical, yeah. But and again, I think the idea of fitness is kind of a terrible one
Mm-hmm.
once you start to
Yeah.
pick at it, because it has so many presuppositions baked into it, which are grounded in collapsing
Mm-hmm.
this idea of, effortful self-improvement, and the more receptive acceptance of what it's of our own nature. And pretending that we don't really have a nature, and in fact we're just purely self-fashioning creatures. And I
Right.
mean, even I know, I'm going to get shouted at by those of my friends who love lifting weights, but I just viscerally hate gyms. I really dislike that environment, because to every one of those machines just looks to me like it's a kind of, as yet another kind of, technological utterance, reinforcing that basic presumption that, we're just
Mm.
sort of, protean plastic matter, to be fashioned by an effort of pure will to, whatever end we see we choose for ourselves. And to me that whole premise, that whole paradigm is just nonsense. And and those are my friends who lift will dispute that and say, no, absolutely, you're completely wrong, Mary. And there's absolutely a sort of pragmatic recognition of strengths, and you're testing yourself against your own limits and blah blah
Mm.
blah. But it's not for me. It's not for me. I'm
Well,
grumpy about this because I had to. There isn't room in my room to do a yoga practice in this hotel, so I had to use the fitness center. So I was thinking about running machines as I was doing my sun
mhm.
salutation down there in the basement with no natural light. And just think, why would you go to a why would you go to a hotel and then disappear into the basement and run on a running machine? What is with
Yeah.
that? Why would you not just go outside and go for a run? I don't get it. I don't get it. Explain this to me, Rafe. This is your field of
Yeah,
expertise.
well, it's
Explain this to
because
me.
we're
Why?
treating the body mechanically, right? If you think about what a gym is, it's a factory for the production of optimized human body parts,
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right.
and it comes
And,
out
may,
of that
and maybe
mindset.
and maybe
And
it's more of a workshop than a production line. But you can
sure,
imagine that, if people found a way of turning that into a production line, applying Fordism
oh
to the
yeah,
uh,
I think they
then they
have,
would.
right? There's like curves, or like there's these specific things where everybody goes in and does exactly the same sequence, right? So you're literally
Oh well,
going
yeah,
through a
yeah.
production
Yeah.
line capacity.
Suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah. So and that was the fundamental sort of critique that comes with Evolve Move Play, is this idea that actually you're supposed to be outside, you're supposed to move, you're supposed to interact with nature. You have an evolved nature that has a desire for movement, and it's expressed in children's play. And that's sort of how we re-embody ourselves and
Mm.
remember. And also it's a really powerful way of re-enchanting the world, which is a really interesting aspect of this question that is coming up in these spaces, right? Like the technological worldview has unhomed us from our own bodies and our relationship to the world. And then it's
Completely
resulted
agree.
in a deep confusion about even the capacity to consider the idea of the good. The good doesn't really exist anymore.
Mm.
We replace it with power or freedom, and that's something that I wanted to double click on, because I suddenly started to make this connection between what you talk about as the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care as like much broader problems in it. I think that
Yes.
once
Yeah. Yeah.
you kind of get at the metaphysical roots here and you sort of accept the nominalist frame, or if you run down the nominalism train and the techno train, you end up with this thing where there's just the production of will and the capacity to have more choice. And when you're in that frame, then everything that is human nature actually stands in the way.
It's just an obstacle.
Whereas,
Or it's an opportunity for it. It might be an opportunity for commercial development at
mm,
best,
yeah.
or at worst, it's just an obstacle to human freedom. So sometimes it can be both of those things at once. Yeah, no, I in the course of writing Feminism Against Progress, I sort of clarified some of this terrain to myself, and by the end, I realised that it's a much deeper rabbit hole than
Mm,
feminism was my way into it. But as you say, it's a very much more general and very much deeper set of problems that have to do with how we what we think humans are for,
mhm,
what we think a person is, even, and and our collective cultural direction of travel. I mean, if I have brands for, I mean, everything that you set out about that you've just described about, how once you accept the technological mindset, if you like, and
mhm.
its way of ordering everything which exists, including humans ourselves, as sort of resources to be enclosed and either strip mined or exploited for individual to whatever end, through the application of pure will and scientific power. Well, once you accept those premises, in a sense, the train just has all the way to its final conclusion. And I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but I'm sort of both optimistic and low key terrified by the fact that it feels like AI really is the final endpoint of
Yeah, I
that
agree.
it really feels like the final boss of that particular paradigm.
I,
Because I mean, as I've characterized it over the course of the 20th century, we set out to enclose and commodify every aspect of the human person. And if you think about again, borrowing from classical philosophy, the ancient conception of the soul was as having three parts: eros, thumos, and logos. So
mhm,
eros being our passions, our desires; thumos being our embodied,
will.
the will, and logos being our capacity for rational thought. And if you think about what the contraceptive pill does, it colonizes eros,
Mhm,
the whole terrain of desire, and there's a whole sort of economy of desire which then follows the 1960s revolution. You can
mhm,
see that happening in the culture downstream of that part of the transhumanist revolution. And my read on social media is that it is in a sense a commodification of thumos, of the desire for recognition and glory,
mhm,
and it hijacks the desire for recognition and diverts it from doing actually meaningful work in the world
mhm.
towards just posting, editing your profile and just creating personae on the internet. But the end of level boss for that entire trajectory is the technologization of logos through
Mm,
AI. And if I have any reason for cause for hope, and it's a slightly kind of bleak picture, it's that in the course of pursuing that, I think it's just gonna force the metaphysical issue on what a person actually is. Because I think we're gonna get to the end of that and we'll realize that we've created something that has thought like emanations, but it's still not thought. And
mm,
actually, what it's doing, and that will find ultimately force us to get to grips with the question of what consciousness actually is, and all of those ways which, in my view, I think we have it somewhat backwards at the moment. And if there's it's a very that scene at the end of the Truman Show where he gets to the end of the sea and he climbs up the
mhm.
previously invisible steps and he finds the door. It's a small door and it's very difficult to see, but it's there, and I think, and it's out the other side of whatever the hell the AI cultural apocalypse looks
Yeah,
like.
that's that's a rich. It's interesting when you talked about Thomos. I was thinking about this idea of essentially. I've been reading about the idea of egregores, right? And the
Ah,
internet is
yes.
sort of like these spirits, and there's something like a desire to become the dominant voice within an online chorus of a
Mm,
specific spirit, right?
mm, that's
You
right.
your will can dominate many when you align it with a specific spirit and
Mm,
and have a particular talent for it. And it's a incredibly tempting thing for human beings in a weird
mm,
way. And then And then this new AI thing, it's, I've been playing around with ChatGPT. I didn't for a long time because I was like, I don't want to feed this thing. And then you realize you kind of got to understand what's happening. And it's become so clever. And also, what's interesting is how much it seduces you, right?
Mm,
ChatGPT, when it first started, was kind of testy. It wasn't very like if you pushed it on things that it didn't agree with, it would be testy. It wasn't very smooth. It wasn't a very like it wasn't an awkward, it was an awkward person to talk to. ChatGPT
mm,
now is incredibly charming, right? It wants
mm,
to just like everything else, it wants to capture your attention. And so it always has if you ask it for one thing, it always says, well, do you want me to do this next thing? And if you lay out a thought for it, it always tells you how brilliant you are and how smart you are and like all these
mm.
things. And it's just constantly sort of stroking your ego. And you can really easily imagine that everyone could just disappear down a hole where they just chat with their chatbots all the time because the chatbot can be trained to essentially externalize your own thinking and then make you feel good about it, right? It's and you can imagine how deeply seductive that is in a really dangerous way.
Yeah.
And so if you look at what's happened with social media, what's happened with all these things, every one of these things sort of exists to capture your attention. I really love
Mm.
Jonathan Pajot's sort of way of pointing out that all of that attention is like a form of worship.
Yep. 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 I
And
mean,
so,
I don't think I don't think all of us are going to disappear into Chat GPT enabled shut-in status,
mhm.
but I think maybe a good analogy, a nice embodied analogy again might be the temptation offered by junk food. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm visiting. I'm
yeah,
speaking to you unusually from the United States. I normally live in Britain.
yeah.
We have our own panoply of junk foods, but over here it's just on another level.
Mm,
I went to Target yesterday when I landed in the city where I am now, just to wander around the junk food aisles and just contemplate the sheer volume and variety and colourfulness and just seductiveness of the packets there, just selling things which to me just really didn't look like food at all, but which are they're there in the grocery section as
yeah.
food. I was just marveling at just the sheer quantity of it. Um, and and yet, there are, but and what that does, when that's all just there for the taking for anybody who chooses to, and it's offered to you on the basis that you can choose to eat it or you can choose not to eat it. Some people manage to retain an understanding of their nature, and some people manage to hold to an understanding of what's good and healthy. And just like I forget the terms you used from Viveki, you
Impressive.
are able to just
Yeah.
dismiss all of those aisles as irrelevant to them, and some people are seduced.
Mm,
And again, there's a class component to it, and you get and so poverty and obesity are very closely correlated across the developed world. This is well understood, because there are some people have have the inner resources to resist that, and some people don't. And it's an incredibly difficult. It's a brutal scissor for character.
mhm.
And I think what we're looking at now with the digital revolution, particularly with the AI revolution, is the same scissor, but not for the body, for the mind.
Yeah, yeah.
So you will end up with a minority who are still who are sustaining cognitive fitness, cognitive ability, and are doing so intentionally. And you will and then you'll have a whole panoply of other people who have the intellectual equivalent of morbid type 2 diabetes. And
I-
and then everyone in between is sort of struggling somewhere in the middle. But that's the terrain that we're looking at now.
I
And
was,
it's kind of horrifying. Like yesterday when I was on the plane flying in here, I walked down the aisle and just did a little informal count. And this was a coast to coast flight, so this is, I mean, it's a crude metric of elite Americans, but like the people
mhm.
flying from the west coast to the east coast, chances
Yeah,
are they're a certain type of American, right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
understand, you know what I'm.
Mhm,
And I was like, okay, so these are coastal Americans for the most part,
mhm.
and looking at their dress and their bearing and so on, it's clearly these are coastal Americans. And I was, what, how many of them are reading a physical book? And
Mm,
I included, for the sake of argument, I included Kindle readers in that, because that's
yeah,
still, the Paperwhite is close enough
yeah,
for jazz. It was roughly 10%, which feels
yeah,
about right to me. And and everybody else was scrolling. We
yeah. I was laying
10%.
I was laying in my my head in my wife's lap last night, and I was saying, like, I read, I read about 30, 40 books a year, and I still feel like I'm really weak in reading relative to what I was before I had access to a smartphone.
Right, right.
Right.
But relative to those guys with cognitive type 2 diabetes, you're like, I don't know, you're
I'm
you're
peak fitness,
Hercules.
but I'm so far from
Right,
what a, an intellectual of, 1995 was, right?
right,
When I
right,
was, when I was remembering that my wife was at the University of Santa Cruz when we got together, and I left my university to go spend a year with her, but I wanted to keep studying. So I went to the stacks, and I came back with a stack of 30 books that were technical books. And I was like intending to read them. And I didn't read all of them, but I would sit down and read cover to cover books about, about hybridization in large mammals. And, I have a household full of books, and it's still harder. It's harder for me to sit down and force myself to do it. And I can feel how my attention
yeah,
has
yeah,
been broken down and
yeah.
controlled by these systems that my work requires me to participate in many ways. But so I, we only have about 5 minutes left, so I want to close this by going back to this idea of freedom versus care, because I think that's really, really central. Because I think that the idea of the feminism of care points to sort of the opposite of this technological worldview, which is a worldview that is actually fundamentally about love. That
Mhm.
we have to love being, we have to love the nature of humans, love the nature of the world around us, love the nature of men, and love the nature of women in order to actually live lives that are towards the good. And as long as we're focused on freedom and not the good, we're going to continue to make these same mistakes. The I was reading your essay on the AI pork prism, right? And so sorry, my mind is trying to churn through a lot of this, but I see so much this idea that somehow greater layers of freedom, greater freedom from the constraints of being a human, is somehow the good that is sought through technology. And I have you read That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis?
No, although no.
I highly recommend it because it's amazingly prescient in the same
Mm.
way as Orwell and Huxley, but in a very different way. And it's particularly for the moment because there's a scene where the directors of NICE, the National Institute for Controlled Experimentation, reveal that the ultimate end is the eradication of all organisms, all living things, because living things are dirty, and their replacement
Mhm.
with mineral intelligence.
Ha. Okay.
And you realize that that is actually a current thought. That's a current egregore within Silicon Valley.
Yeah,
Because
it absolutely is, and people are very explicit about it. If you read people like Nick Bostrom, and who's the Swedish guy at Oxford? Yeah. I mean, the Martin Rothblatt, people like that were write explicitly about how the end point, the end point of all of this. And actually, this again connects it to feminism. Transgenderism is the on ramp to feminism,
yep,
and in as much
to
as
transhumanism.
yeah, is transgenderism is the on ramp to transhumanism, and the end point of transhumanism is the escape from physiology altogether towards what Rothblatt calls freedom of form.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, in as much as feminism has turned away from, emancipation from human nature back towards much more a metaphysic grounded in a realist acceptance of human nature and of our dimorphic nature. It's because more increasingly, the further we've gone down this path, the more and more women have grasped that really women's bodies are the front line for that kind of transhumanism. And actually, when you look at when you even glance at what that looks like in practice, you realize it's just the stuff of nightmares. Women and children are first up on the chopping block, and the result is horrendous, is horrifying. And the costs of liberation are just so unacceptably high that this there's no way that this can be plausibly presented as a feminist project. It's very straightforwardly not that. And yeah, and just watching that happen and watching and putting those pieces together has brought together a very unlikely coalition of women from, you know, some of them are tradition, some of them are Catholics, some of them are some of them are radical feminists, some of them, you know, they don't agree, and some of them are more conventional feminists. Yeah, and there are often major points of disagreement sort of within the underlying philosophy, but what unites them is just the recognition that the transhumanist project is, you know, women are first on the chopping block, and behind, and we're standing in front of children, and you know, if they'll go through us if they have to, and we're just not going to let that happen.
In a conversation with Jonathan Pageau, he quoted a feminist theorist who said something like, the point of theory is the defeat of recalcitrant nature. It's not exactly that, but it's something along those lines. And so what I'm hearing you say is that as we have marched towards the defeat of recalcitrant nature, it's in some sense women and children who end up on the chopping block first. C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man said, ultimately the power of man to make himself
That's right. It becomes the power of
whatever
one
he
man over
pleases
another.
is the power
Yeah.
of some men to make other men into what they please, right? The power of
Yes.
man's dominion over nature is man's dominion over each other, and
Absolutely.
ultimately, in some sense, it's women's rights and children's rights that get trampled first in that run to see who sits at the top of the
Yeah.
hierarchy
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
pure freedom
And
and power.
I think if you find all of these really quite disparate groups, you know, finding themselves, you know, with, you know, an expression of surprise reading ancient medieval thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, or even going all the way back to Aristotle, it's simply because it's kind of like it's the only ride left in town. It's the only framework left that offers anything more substantial, a more substantial vantage point from which to have anything to say about this project at all. You have to go back to the arguments that were being made before the nominalist mindset became so completely kind of, you know, thought terminatingly hegemonic, in order to be able to say, no, actually there are some other tools, and we can recover these other tools and we can make use of them. You know, I'm all the way down the scholastic rabbit hole at the moment, because I've just realized there's it's a toolkit. It's just, you know, all of those tools are right there, you know, but they probably need, you know, they might need shining up a little bit and maybe translating into some more, you know, more accessible language at times. But they're right there, and we really need that metaphysical artillery, because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate.
Mary, we've come to the end of the time that you've got for me this morning. This was, as I expected, an extremely potent conversation. We didn't get into formal and final cause. So I think I'm
Not
going
in
to have
time.
to maybe write you some letters and some back and forth, because it feels too rich to stop here at this point. But thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. People can find you on Unheard and on Substack. Is there anything else that people should know about where to find Mary Harrington on the internet?
I think those are the main places. That's where my stuff goes.
Any final words as we sum up our conversation here?
I think no, I think I'm good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.